Good morning or afternoon. Good
Oh,
afternoon. We are live on the internets.
how exciting. Nice to see you
Yes,
and
so far
nice
so
to
good.
be
So
here
just
with everybody.
waving at anyone who's like, oh, there's one person. Hello. Um, so yes, we are here for part of Explorathon 2020, which is not the Explorathon we originally planned to do. Because 2020 went a little bit different. But we're going to do something fun today. Um, so I'm here. So I'm Suzanne. I work with public engagement at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in the UK, and I'm here with my. I think we're friends, but I think co-conspirator, uh,
Yes,
fellow mischief maker, Jane Essex, who you're based in the education department.
I certainly am. Yes. And I have two interesting parts to my job. One is that I train chemistry teachers, and the other part is that I research and carry out practice in inclusive STEM education, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Exactly. So just if anyone in the chat, if they can't hear us or if our volumes are a bit wonky, do let us know, because we're new to this. But yeah, so this is not your first Explorathon.
No, I've been coming to Explorathon as long as I've been in Scotland, which is now 3.5 very happy years. I came as a helper to the first year just to get a feel for what went on. I think not long after that first Explorathon, you and I met again looking at the Young Chemical Ambassadors Challenge. And I suggested that the activities were wonderful, but that there were youngsters who would enjoy the activities, but would struggle for various practical reasons with the Young Chemical Ambassadors scheme as it was offered to the majority of youngsters. And so I suggested I could borrow the activities and have a day event at the university. And you and Joy Leckie, amongst others, were very kind and supportive and said, oh, yes, help yourself, change them, do what you like with them, you said. Put
Yep.
cornflour everywhere, you said brightly. And we duly did. And
Yep.
after that, we decided that there was such an interest in inclusive STEM that we would look to put this on the Explorathon programme as well as running events at the university. So for 2 years, we've had inclusive and accessible STEM activities running at the lovely Riverside Museum.
Yep. Shout out to the
Um,
Riverside.
and we have had, last year, we developed it by having a professional development session afterwards for a discussion with people from various walks of life, not just the museum, but there was somebody working in the NHS, there was somebody working in the third sector who were interested in making STEM offerings more inclusive and accessible. And so this year we're doing it online to keep ourselves COVID safe, but still talking about this great need for making STEM more truly inclusive and accessible for everybody.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's been one of like my personal highlights of Explorathon for the last few years. So it's kind of it's great to be able to do something this year, if not quite. Um, the chat are kind of keeping me. If I'm ever looking off this way, it's because I'm trying to do several things at once.
I suspect the chat is going to be quite a lot more engaging than some of the things I'm telling you, Suzanne, but you do what you like.
Absolutely, absolutely not. So your work is about making things accessible,
Hmm.
and I guess kind of uh, as a starter, a lot of people would kind of, even if they kind of don't think they think it, but they think of education as being for the purposes of creating people who will be good little functions in the economy. Um, would you agree
So,
with that?
well, I think that's something desirable that we have an economy, but I think we need to take a much more 360 view on this and we need to move away, I would venture from a purely economic analysis of value. I think many of us in STEM education are really engaging with Louise Archer and her team's idea of science capital as a way of looking at how science can be useful to young people, not just as a career gatekeeper subject, but to help them make sense of their everyday lives, to help them build social connections with other people who share their interest in astronomy, nanotechnology, whatever it is. And for me, looking at particularly children who are in some way exceptional in their learning approaches, I think there's so much learning benefit to doing science. And I've recently published a paper actually about a year I spent working with a school for children with complex additional support needs.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the children in there were hugely physically dependent, communicated by eye gazing. And I did wonder if science had anything distinctive to offer them, because they were really struggling just to get through their days. And actually, they loved science. And these children, when the science box came out, their blink rate went up and their eyes widened and they were, oh, great, it's science.
Mm-hmm.
So I think science is just about something that gives people a better quality of life. I think it can open economic pathways. That's part of capital. That's what it means in part. But it means so much more. And I think one of the mistakes that STEM educators have made is to focus exclusively on the economic benefits of STEM rather than the cultural, social, emotional benefits. Because if you look at it in that way, you find it has far more to offer to far more people.
I was going to say I couldn't have said it better myself, but I mean that's because you are literally an expert in this field. So yeah, you can say. I mean, yeah, and I think that is kind of something that a lot of time when we talk about, like, doing STEM engagement, particularly kind of from within a university setting, it does end up they fall into the trap of thinking about, like, and then you can study it as an undergrad, or it opens a door
Yeah,
for careers,
and this
and that's
this
good.
is,
Yeah.
of course, and I'm not anti people doing degrees in STEM, because I did it myself. Two of my children are doing STEM degrees. I'm not anti it, but I feel it's a very limited view of what STEM has to offer. And I think one of the hidden downsides of it is that there are many young people in our schools who could be pursuing STEM beyond compulsory school level, be
Mm-hmm.
that in FE, be that through an apprenticeship, through a work, whatever. And they are put off by this elitist notion of STEM being for the most able. And I think that our over focus on recruiting our undergraduates, actually we lose many children at that stage because they've picked up the message about who STEM is for, and it's a wrong message in my view. And in some ways, I hope by working with really diverse learners of all sorts, I give a counter message to say, if you redefine STEM as something for not simply economic development, suddenly it becomes open to everybody and it becomes valuable to everybody. I mean, I have to share, Suzanne, I was really amazed when I did this study in the school, because I went down, I was supported by the Royal Society of Chemistry, their outreach fund let me go and work with the school, which was very kind of the Royal Society of Chemistry. And it became very obvious there was going to be some interesting data to gather. But to begin with, the teachers all sat around going, I'm not a scientist, I don't want to do science, I'm just going to do literacy and numeracy. And I bided my time and I spotted opportunities to say, well, have you tried this? Should I bring you that? Should I go out to the shop and buy some cola and mints for you to do a Mentos fizz with the kids? And by the end of the year, having done science and gained confidence, they were absolutely, in fact, they were using this approach of experiential learning, structured thinking, development of things like the idea of opposites. And they were using that to inform their numeracy and literacy work rather than saying, oh, you know, time to stop science, it's numeracy. They would just sort of segue into the numeracy almost. And at the end of the year, I was naughty. I posed a hypothetical questions to all these people at the start of the year, and I have them on audio recordings. I don't want to do science. I don't know why they're making us do science. It's ridiculous. Well, I can't do science. And at the end, I said, okay, suppose the senior leadership now say, well, science has been fun. It's great. Now let's move on and do Scottish country dancing every Wednesday instead. What's your reaction? Huge relief? Equal panic to when you heard about science? And I got two answers. And since they were all individual interviews, I'm sure they hadn't concocted this as a group. It was either, oh, our head teacher goes to a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. I'm just going to do it on a Wednesday afternoon and shut my door, because if they don't see I'm doing science, how will they worry about it? And the other one was the activist. I'm going to write a petition. I'm going to get all the parents of the kids in my class to sign my petition. So they were basically telling me, after 9 months of trying science, and they had no lab, you know, it was all kitchen stuff and whatever, they'd moved from the I don't want to do science, it's pointless for me, it's pointless for the children I work with, through to my kids love science and I will do guerrilla science rather than lose it from my curriculum.
Yay,
And I think that's the
subversion.
most sincere testimony I can give you.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. You made them want to do science even if someone tried to stop them.
Which I thought was a real turnabout.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. What was the name of that paper? I can
Oh, I think it was towards truly,
truly inclusive. Yeah, I'll drop that in case anyone wants to check out. That's
yeah,
open access, is
it's open access.
it?
Yeah,
Right. So if anyone did want to have a look, see. Um,
you don't need a subscription or anything. You can just have it.
um,
Okay, but it was a really interesting study because I feel generally that there's far too little attention paid to how curriculum plays out with different learners, and STEM's particularly bad because it has this elitist sort of, let's get the undergraduates, let's get the next engineer generation in. And so people haven't looked hard enough. They haven't been supported to look at what good STEM education would look like for children who learn in very different ways. So it was really nice to go and look.
Yeah. So I think we're probably all pretty much on board with this idea now. So I guess maybe let's define some terms, because while we are both very much on board with inclusive STEM education for everybody, you don't work with. I mean, it's impossible for you to do inclusive STEM with literally everybody, much as you might want to. So who are your audience that you work most closely with?
Okay, well, as you say, I'll work with anybody who I think is marginalised by STEM, but the audience that I particularly focus on when I get the opportunity are those with global learning difficulties. So I also work with children who have autism, say, and global learning difficulties, but I'm particularly interested in children who aren't behind their age group in one or two specific cognitive areas, but who have an overall picture of delayed development in terms of language, thinking, motor skills, all of that. And say, I think they're fascinating because they've been totally overlooked as potential scientists and technologists, but their own way they truly are. So what I don't do, Suzanne, is I'm not very interested in ASN labels or diagnoses. I'm only ever interested in functional things. You know, so and so likes to know in advance what the room's going to be like that he's going to. okay, now that might well be because they're on the autistic spectrum, but that might be because they've had some horrendous experience as a younger person of going to an unfamiliar place and a very bad thing happening of some sort. And it doesn't really matter to me what the diagnosis is, because I'm not seeking to correct their fear of the unknown. I'm seeking to accommodate that and build that into how I plan their STEM work.
Mm-hmm.
So I take it as given. If they say they don't like unexpected things, I tell them what's going to happen. I show them a photo of the room. I give them the list of activities for the day so that they feel they're not coming to the unknown. And why that is just doesn't matter to me,
Yep. And I mean, I
because
think
I'm
it's,
I'm not doing it as therapy.
yeah.
I'm doing it because I want them to have fun and to learn. So
Yeah, and I
this,
mean, it's kind of this. Some of this feels like it should be kind of more common sense, but it's not necessarily put in front of people. Um, and yeah,
so
as someone in the chat said, it can be very anxiety inducing
mm,
to ask for accommodations. And I think
oh,
you
I've
were saying just
researched that.
before,
Yeah.
you might set up an event and like if you say it's accessible explorathon, accessible STEM, whether or not the labeling it as accessible, is it stigmatizing or not stigmatizing or empowering?
Well, I would never want to disempower anybody, particularly not some of these children who I've got to say they are the most wonderful children to work with, truly. They are my favourites of all the children I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a lot. But I am aware, and I did research again on this, and I've given you, I think, Suzanne, the PDF for this,
Mm-hmm.
that certainly teachers were very loath to tell organisers what their children needed because they were frightened that we would turn them away from the event if they, quote unquote, made demands. And I was really upset when I got this data in, because the Equality 2010 Act exactly says your students have a particular need, just let us know. And as far as it is reasonable, and I'm talking things like I'd like to see the room before I go into it. I can have a photo. That to me is entirely reasonable. And it really worries me that people feel so unable to ask for very simple, very, very modest modifications. And I think it speaks of a world where when we talk a lot about equality and diversity and inclusion, but people's lived experiences are often of hostility to diversity. And I think one of the things I need to sort of put in at this point is we've struggled through the sexual identity revolution, where we now understand that people aren't necessarily straight or gay, or there are lots of ways of being, and they change through a person's life, and we're all
Mm-hmm.
reasonably, or they can do, and we're comfortable with that. But we
Mostly, yeah.
still we still struggle with the idea that children who have some sort of support need, or as I prefer to say, some support entitlement, that support might change with time. They might have a developmental phase and suddenly their speech becomes quite comprehensible, whatever. And I don't think our labeling process really allows for the fluidity of development. And I really do see people who develop in quite exceptional but positive ways. I mean, I haven't shared, but some of you will know, I have a sister with profound learning difficulties and who's on the autistic spectrum. She's non-verbal. They'd taught her, speech and language therapists had tried 3 times to teach her Makaton sign language. absolutely resistive.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption of some was she was too learning impaired to learn it. At 35, they tried again. She was on their rota. They came back every 4 years to her. And at 35, in a week, she was fluent in Makaton. So I had to rush off and become the same. Okay, 35 isn't a recognised age for people to develop language use.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's the age your brain and your social context and your motivation makes it the age for you to acquire it, we have to be open to that.
Yeah.
Not saying, well, you were labelled as you were diagnosed as autistic when you were 4. So,
That's it. Yeah.
that's you. And if you haven't used language by 8, you'll not be doing it.
Yeah.
Why? Why? And this is what I find a lot with the learners I do STEM with, that there are some very low expectations of some people. Less families, sometimes school staff have quite low expectations. And it's always such a pleasure to give children a chance to be hugely successful in an arena like a university lab,
Mm-hmm.
where everybody goes, oh, wow, that's amazing. You managed to separate the dyes, work out which fizzy drink was which.
Yep. You got to wear a lab coat.
Oh, we do the lot. And I think that status thing, although it works against science in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
when people can succeed in it, it makes the success particularly sweet. And that's what I'm always looking to give people.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of
success.
Yeah, and that there is also an aspect of identity creation. It's not that you're doing the activity, but you're doing the activity in an actual science lab, in a lab coat. You're a real scientist, and I think that's something that not
And
everyone.
what's really interesting about that, and it links to this, is every year we're very lucky. We get amazing help from students, postgraduate staff at these events. And I have to pay generous tribute to colleagues and students at Strathclyde who have very much taken this vision to their hearts. But one of the things the children report most highly on of these events is the chance to talk to, as they call them, real scientists. These are the undergraduates or postgraduates. And the children love being able to give them what they think of as difficult science questions and have a scientific conversation with somebody who they feel is an expert. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity that I couldn't get round all 60 of them and do that.
Yeah.
But those lovely students and staff make that possible for these youngsters. So bless them all.
Absolutely. I've definitely enjoyed a lot of the conversations I've been able to have with people. I've got actually an interesting comment from the chat.
Yeah.
Joseph said, I've often found the people who are most passionate about accessibility, other than the disabled people themselves, obviously, are relatives or loved ones of disabled people. I mean, you've obviously talked about your sister there.
Yeah.
Can this passion be ignited in others?
Yes.
People who are not. Have you experienced that?
Oh, certainly. I have colleagues who came along to the first events I ran at Strathclyde, and they came along sort of, I think, out of a feeling of some small duty and, well, it's my good deed for the week. I have some who've now been back for 3 consecutive years and are on my frequent flyers list and need to know as soon as I fix the dates for the next lot, because they'll come again. And it's not always the people who you think of as the natural pastoralists.
Mm-hmm.
There was a professor at the last university I worked at, which is in West London. He was a professor of experimental techniques, which you might think, oh God, that sounds a bit of a difficult mix with kids with learning difficulties. But he'd never worked with anybody. He admitted, in a very exceptional little elitist bubble. But I persuaded him because he was the man that had the liquid nitrogen.
Oh.
My motivation was purely,
you got to befriend the person with the liquid nitrogen keys.
Yeah, you so got it. And he came, and afterwards I said, so I only ever ask people to do this once. If they are very nervous, I say, will you try it once? And if you're really uncomfortable, that's okay. Just give it a go before you say definitely no. And this professor said, do you know, there was a kid in there asked me such a good question. I wished I could take him for a PhD because he was thinking so differently and so clearly. And it was amazing, the question he asked. And similarly, a colleague at Strathclyde,
Mm-hmm.
who'd never knowingly worked with a group who had exceptional learning sort of characteristics, asked him to do the lecture demo once, said, if you really hate it, I won't ask you again. I don't bully people. I just ask you to try it and see how you find it. And
Mm-hmm.
he's like signed up for every year now.
There you go.
Another one. So I think it's the experience that does it for some people
Mm-hmm.
rather than the moral or intellectual arguments. And that's another reason for doing inclusive STEM rather than talking about doing it as we're having to do today.
Yeah. And we will in hopefully in the spring, probably during British Science Week, get a chance to
We're
do
actually going to,
inclusive STEM.
yeah.
But I guess kind of, I mean, obviously there will be some people who will kind of go down the route of what's the point in this kind of work, and you know we've discussed that a bit, but there'll also be people who are like, okay, this seems pretty cool, but there's a lack of confidence that they don't know what to expect because, I mean, if they themselves don't have the experience of having a close family friend, a lot of the type of complex global needs that you're talking about, they might not be in mainstream schools. So someone who goes through kind of the normal school system might not come across them. So what kind of accommodations might somebody have to take when they're engaging with your audiences? And how
Well,
can we demystify that a bit, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, there are things that we know are more commonly problematic
Mm-hmm.
for this group of learners. So we know, for instance, they tend to, not always, but as a group, if you took 100 children with global learning difficulties and 100
Mm-hmm.
neurotypical so-called children, you'd find more of them had short-term memory. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to say to people, if you tell the visitors something and then they ask you again, it's not because they're being rude or they were looking out of the window, it's because remembering this is hard.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also model all of this in the way that we set up the activities. So for instance, when we made bath bombs a couple of years back now, our wonderful technician Pam, who I have to again thank as another generous and inventive and creative colleague, marked everything that was to do with the citric acid in red and everything that was to do with the bicarbonate of soda in blue, and put triangles on the blue and circles, so even if you were colorblind you could see
Mm-hmm.
which set of apparatus to use with each of your two white powders, which weren't hugely different. And so you're supporting things like variable literacy level,
Mm-hmm.
variable numeracy. Some of the youngsters I work with are happier with things like big, little, rather than 50 grams and 100 grams.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. I doesn't matter to me. We can put support in if there's weighing needed. We can have helpers on the balances to just make sure everybody's okay and give as much help as lets them succeed. There are things that you can plan ahead for. So memory, processing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't give 3 instructions at once.
Mm-hmm.
Give one, sorry, that's my insulin pump. Give one instruction, say, come back and tell me when you've done that,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll help you with the next bit. Other things, and this is under review at the moment. This paper stems from some work I did last year. 2 of the things that came up quite frequently in the students I studied last year was massively variable self-esteem. So 1 minute they'd be saying, oh yeah, I can do science, I'm good at science, and then 5 minutes later, oh no, I can't do this, I'm terrible at science.
Mm-hmm.
And preparing people just to respond in the moment to what the child says at that point, and then say, well, hang on, do you remember you just sorted out who murdered the professor in the morning challenge? So I don't think you are that bad at science. I think perhaps you're worried this afternoon and you feel you're bad at science. So engage with where they are, but trying to move them to where you'd like them to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that came up, and I really hadn't expected this, and I suppose that's the art of research, finding the unexpected, was to what extent psychosocial difficulties and interpersonal relationships specifically affected the learning. You know, I saw a teacher who spent some lessons, nearly half her time was sorting out who was friends with who didn't want to sit with who'd just come in from a fight with who else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the delayed learning accompanies, and I'm not postulating which causes which, delayed social development. So when I see them at lower secondary in S1, some of the social stuff is more like my primary colleagues might be seeing in B3 or B4.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to go down and meet that. So my advice to anybody working with learners like this is listen to them, work with them, be led by them. And one of my mottos is I always set up activities and challenges that can be got wrong and repeated without any risk, any loss of self-esteem. Just, oh, well, that wasn't quite what we expected. Do you know what happened? Do you want to have another go? And one of my practical rules for an event like this is I always have twice as much stuff as I ought to need so that everybody can get it wrong and have another go and have success before we finish. So, but I think really it's so basic, it's as basic as listen to and respect the learners.
And I mean, that advice will get you far in life. I think there's kind of one thing that I've noticed myself, and I think you actually gave a good example of it there. The idea of using colors and shapes to kind of match up things that
Yeah.
that you know the instruction with the thing. And I mean, you gave an example of that being really useful for people who are colorblind. So if you were doing a STEM experiment at a science festival,
Yeah.
then you could have someone come up to you who's colorblind, and that would be really useful. Or some of the written broken down is that you'll do instructions that have photographs alongside them, and that could be really useful for somebody who has recently moved to the country and is still grappling with English language. So there's a whole pile of, I mean, you accommodations can never be perfect, and sometimes you'll have accommodations that conflict. But a lot of the times, putting accommodations in place and being ready to do accommodations is it's better not just for when you're dealing with people with particular accessibility entitlements. I like the change to entitlements there, but it's, I mean, it will just make you better at running events and running activities for literally anybody, because you never know who you're talking to.
No, that's right. And I think, you know, we say in inclusion, or a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think that's absolutely true at a practical level. But beyond that, Suzanne, I think the fact that you have made very small practical adjustments to improve the accessibility sends out a really big message. So one of the things I always do at the festivals and events I run at the university is I always book a room that has actually no windows. It sounds horrible. I'd hate to teach it on this report, but it is labelled the quiet room. So if somebody's over sort of excited, overstimulated by everything, they can sit safely in a dark room with no windows, but just over the way from where we're all in the lab. I've never ever had anybody need to use that room, but I've had ever so many teachers say, oh gosh, I was just worried that one of mine might sort of have a bit of a meltdown, and I was so relieved to see that there was quiet space to go to.
Yeah.
And it's almost by making the accommodation, you may not need it, but you're giving people a clear message about, we've thought about the things that might be difficult for you and your visitors, and we're trying our best to make this pleasant and possible for you.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that there'll be times when someone is starting to feel overwhelmed, and knowing that if they need it, they
They can
can
just
step
be
away
free.
is
Yeah.
actually is almost already starts diffusing the situation for
Yeah.
them, rather
Yeah.
than feeling yourself getting wound up further and further without an escape.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. But these are all very, you know, people who sort of are nice about my work, and thank you to all of you, whoever you are. I kind of think this is all very small practical stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's trying to show people that's what inclusion is.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply big rhetoric, it's actually just small adjustments, thinking, asking people what's helpful, what's not. You know, that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Looking at who's
some
not at the table.
always, that's always my first question: who's not here and why aren't they here? Yep.
Mm-hmm. It's usually a good place to start. Yes, there's some appreciation in the chat for the quiet room and how like it should just be normalized, which I definitely
Yeah.
agree. We are running into the problem that I suspected we would run into, in that we could probably talk for another three
Yeah.
hours.
But we
But
mustn't, because
I
people have Saturdays to
we
go
do.
to.
I think we did promise people we were going to get messy. And a couple of
Yes,
people
would you like to get messy?
have mentioned fizzy Mentos. So
We have both, Suzanne. Just let me move things that could get wet and destroyed.
uh-huh. But yeah, kind of like showing kind of the kind of experiment that you might do, and like also I think kind of one of the nice things about some of the experiments that Jane does is that they're good jumping off points. It's not like
Uh-huh.
you do the experiment and then you're done. You
No,
know,
no. I'm just going to get myself some water, so just hold that thought.
I have to dance to entertain people. Um, just more support for the quiet room for other uses, physical illness, flare ups, uh, and
Prayer time, it doesn't matter. A quiet room's always a good thing.
mm-hmm.
Um, and this is the art, if there is an art, is thinking about the incredibly possible and making it happen. Right, now this is one that these are two that learners with ASN, I'm going to have to tip my camera slightly.
Right, I'm actually gonna make my own picture go away so people can see you a bit
Right.
better.
Okay, now this is one that's good for all ages. And one of my key things about STEM is I don't make it easy in the sense that it requires low thinking levels, but I do try and make it possible to think about it at various levels, and for all the levels at which you can think about it is counts as success. So a density column, if you've not played with one of these, they're great. Now the key is, I have to say, always to make sure that you don't let the syrup or the washing up liquid stick to the side of your container. Now I've got this plastic kitchen thing, but cut off lemonade bottles are ideal for this too. And you need to make sure you've got enough washing up liquid.
Okay, so the bottom layer was golden syrup, was it?
Golden syrup, maple syrup, honey,
Something
golden
thick
syrup.
and sticky and probably
Yeah.
delicious.
And then pouring, and I'm going to use coloured water here because I want to actually show you the layers. Run it gently down the side.
So syrup at the bottom. The next
Yep.
level was washing up liquid. You were saying.
Yeah, washing up liquid. Now this is just water, but I've added a bit of food dye to it to
Mm-hmm.
visualize the difference, because I've got colourless washing up liquid, which I realise now I use one of the sort of ecological ones because it's nice and gentle on your dry hands.
Uh
But
huh.
I realised yesterday when I did this for some of the primary teachers, actually, who often struggle in the way the special schools do with, how can I do science? I
Mm-hmm.
don't have a lab. So I
Mm-hmm.
always try and give them, oops, there we go. And there's a bit of vegetable oil.
Could you
any
tilt
old.
your camera up slightly so we can just
I
see?
can, Suzanne. I'm so glad I've
Uh,
got you here to do that for me.
yeah,
Wait a
that
minute.
I think that's oh,
Wait a minute. Let me. My trouble is I cycle round with this
perfect.
laptop. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay, so you should now be able to see.
And that was a bit of oil on top, was it?
There's soil on top, which I
Yep.
haven't poured in very well, but no matter. So we've got golden syrup. We've got a layer there of washing up liquid. You've got water, and then you've got oil on the top.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you just put things in and see whether they float or sink.
Yep. And for some, I think it's kind of some. This can be one where it can be good, like if you've got school groups, to have people work in pairs or multiples. Because for some kids, they will want to get their hands totally in there and get messy. And there's some kids who will be
Some
like,
really won't.
that's a lot of sensation. Um,
Yeah.
and that way they can work together. And, like, you know, sometimes one kid might be like, I am going to record all the things, or
Yeah, the other thing I'm very keen on is making good use of digital technology. So a child who didn't want to get their hand directly on, they could take photos of this and look at the photos afterwards.
mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
using digital technologies to mediate between the. So, for instance, some dried lentils go in.
Oh,
I'm just going to poke them down because one of our tests for buoyancy is poking it down and seeing if it rises
okay, all the way to the bottom.
all the way to the bottom and see if it rises. Did this
Um,
yesterday.
can I ask you to put the you had a white towel? Could you kind of put that under and behind it? Just might make it
Yes,
easier
I
to see.
can. Wait a minute. So
Uh,
let's see. Under behind. How's well, it's not totally white. Is that any help?
I think yeah, it's
Yep,
a little bit. I mean, it's always going to be tricky.
it is. Just that was okay. So then there's a grape going in. Let's see if the grape lifts up again. There's a tomato going in. Okay.
Now, someone has said that they're looking to get a nice drink. I wouldn't advise drinking this. A lentil, tomato, and washing up liquid beverage is not recommended.
Okay, so you see, for instance, the tomato starting to rise again. The grape, which has lots of sugar in, tends to stay lower. The one that really interested us yesterday was I have some roasted lentils here. It's
So,
one of the
roasted lentils.
yeah, salad toppings. It's like pretend crisps for people who wish they were eating better. And we were very interested to see, because compared to the dry lentils, which are actually quite dense and go down to the bottom, the roasted lentils, and they have a little bit of oil, and I suspect they've got little air pockets in.
Ah.
If you push them down, they're actually quite hard, and they rise up to the top of the oil, and that really interested us. The whole thing of observing and starting to predict, can you see a pattern? All right, well, what do you think will happen with a piece of macaroni?
Pasta is a key ingredient for science.
Absolutely. I don't know how we manage science until we have pasta.
Uh-huh.
Do you think, for instance, a piece of twisty pasta will be different to a piece of macaroni?
Oh, that one just sank like a
And you
like a
can
rock.
see, perhaps, I don't know whether you can see, but the twisty pasta is sort of lifting up more than the macaroni.
I tell you what, can we after we finished here, can you take a photo of all the things and where they settled, and we can pop it on Twitter?
I certainly will, Suzanne. Yeah. Now, that looks just like messy play, I know. But the next step is to start to get the children to think about, why do you think the twisty pasta doesn't sink as low as the macaroni? What's different about them? So in effect, what we're doing in scientific terms is we're identifying variables. And the next step is, well, can you make a prediction what will happen if I put in rice? Do you think rice will be more like macaroni, more like lentils? And even the very act of finding the words to talk about this is good for learners who have delayed development. And, you know, I was talking about numeracy. You know, you could talk about, let's count in how many pieces of rice. I put in, I think, 5 lentils. Let's count in rice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bits of rice. Let's see if they're different. And they just the whole issue of, I'm just seeing what's happened here. I think the tomato's definitely higher than the grape.
Yeah, it's gradually making its way, isn't it?
It's resurfacing. Like, it's like the Titanic, this, isn't it? So this is the sort of very simple, very safe, hands-on. Now, all I'll do when I finish with that is I'll pour it through a kitchen sieve into my kitchen sink and wash it away with hot water.
It's already got the washing up liquid, so it's halfway there.
You see, there's method in this madness. And although that looks just like a fun thing, and it is a fun thing, and I never mind science being fun, there's some really good thinking behind it too. Now I'm going to get my fizzes.
Right, so fizzes. So yeah, so what is the difference between the spiral and the macaroni? Does the chat have any theories? We'll give them a minute. We'll give them a minute, and then we can maybe circle back to that after we do the fizzies. But yes, I'm interested because it's one of those things. You're like, okay, density, blah blah blah, you know, and then you're like, okay, but like, why the different shapes of macaroni versus tubes?
Well, we've done this with the young chemical engine ambassadors, of course, haven't we? We used, we got the children to try breaking different forms of long spaghetti and got them to look at why. And all of this, you think, oh, well, this is a bit boring. You've compared variables for the food going in the density column. You've compared, but actually understanding variables and spotting patterns is a key scientific process, but it's a key process for everyday life. How often in your everyday life do you notice a pattern?
I mean, humans are really good at that.
This happens every Tuesday or whatever. This is the stuff of making your life livable and comprehensible. Now, what I'm doing is I've got 3 drinks. I'm going to just pour them in up to there. And you will notice that I have got washing up liquid, and that's deliberate. You'll also notice that I've got lots of towels ready. That's deliberate.
Yeah.
So I've got 3 different drinks.
We've got the theories coming in about the pasta, so we'll get to that. Yep.
Oops. Wow.
One thing I did find, because I've done another experiment about taking the colour out of Iron Brew with activated charcoal, and I ended up having to get some kind of generic shampoo bottles to put the fizzy drinks into to make them look a little less enticing.
Yeah. Well, we as you remember, we did it the other way around. We got them to do the chromatography of the food dyes. And that was really good. And it was quite interesting, that one, because a school came and one of the teachers pointed to a young woman and said, I hope you don't mind, I've brought her. I had to bring her. I went, oh, well, no, it's inclusive and accessible. Next line. This is just why I do the job I do. She won't do anything.
Okay.
But she won't be any bother. And I thought, she's not coming here to do nothing.
Yeah, and I don't mind people being a bother. That's
not unless it is her preference. So I sort of said to her, do you want to come and do an experiment? And she got off her stool and trotted forward. So I taught her how to do the chromatography activity in the morning, and then in the afternoon they had to do it with their fizzy drinks. And the teacher had missed them doing it in the morning, so I had great pleasure in saying to her, well, now you'll not be sure how to do this. B will be able to teach you, won't you? And letting this woman teach the teacher without speaking, because she was non-verbal.
That was a mic drop moment, isn't it? Okay, so
right, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to put in 3 Mentos and see how much mess I can make.
I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it?
Um, so I've used different drinks here, so we can say we're looking at how much fizz is in the different drinks. If
Uh-huh.
I had the same drink, I could do one, two, and three Mentos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so all the time I'm just playing with variables.
Yeah, and I mean, you could kind of be like, have a control where it's like you have a non-fizzy drink,
Yep. Yep.
or stir the fizzy drink before and take down the fizz.
Yeah. Can I
Uh,
just point out this is a work laptop, however, Suzanne?
awesome. IT are going to be angry with me on Monday.
Yeah. Well, they weren't too happy about me cycling around with it and making the screen sugary, but they're nearly over it.
Oh, so that was the Iron Brew. Iron Brew is a very Scottish drink.
Yep.
Uh,
Okay, and three in there.
oh,
Tea towel at the ready because I think you can see without any brand promotion that there are all different amounts of fizz in those drinks.
mm-hmm.
And I'd usually make it relevant by saying, so which of them would make you burp the most?
Well,
And
indeed.
we have the burpiest drink, the next burpiest drink, and the least burpiest drink.
The burp scale. I have to say, you look like you've done this really often because that Coke level is just perfect.
Well, as my mother used to say, Suzanne, the devil takes care of his own. But yeah, and I think that would be a nice, fun activity. You could do little investigations, as I say, changing things. Does it, what if you change the shape of the glass?
Well, indeed.
There's lots of things to look at, and none of it dangerous or whatever, just all fun.
Yeah, and it's getting people to think, and I think as you said earlier, it's like gaining confidence because there
Mm-hmm.
is a perception that science is not for me because, and mostly it's because I'm not a middle class brain box. Um,
Yeah, and also it was interesting, these students I observed last year, they were all in S1. They loved experiments, but
mm-hmm.
they were very nervous about the safety of it. And I always think carefully about work when I work with these learners. Some of them will have no lab experience. So A, it has to be safe, but B, they have to feel it's safe so that they can enjoy it. And it's one of the reasons I like everyday stuff like bath bombs and fizzy drinks,
Mm-hmm.
because the children feel safe. They see things like this at home.
Yeah.
So that's my two little messy activities for you, Suzanne.
Excellent, and yes, definitely post a picture of the
I
density
will.
column.
I
Let's
will.
let's bring it back to our faces, shall we?
Yes, all right, sorry.
Oh,
Oops. There we
okay.
go.
Oh.
Tea towel ready. There we are. Right.
I mean, you did promise people would get messy, so you were just bringing it in there. Okay, so quickly before we kind of get to our, I was going to say closing remarks, but it sounds very boring. Let's talk pasta.
Let's talk. Yeah,
Pasta in
sorry.
the density column. So we've had some people talking about, is there air trapped in the macaroni, or the spiral shape is like,
Should
is it similar to being aerodynamic? Is there a surface area to mass ratio at play here?
Yeah, and all of these are brilliant ideas that I will instantly say, and I would say for children, I don't know, but can you think of a way we could test that idea?
Mm-hmm.
So, I do have quite a collection of pasta in my kitchen cupboard, quite a lot of which I have never eaten. I've only ever done experiments like this with.
Mm-hmm.
And I would quite quickly here, if I was working with a group for longer than kind of half an hour, 40 minutes, I'd be thinking about, could we make maybe some salt dough, dry it out in different shapes, weigh out the same amount of salt dough, make some different shapes to
Mm-hmm.
test out these ideas.
Yeah, and again, it's letting the participants lead. I mean,
Yeah,
it's always kind of having a kind of a seed like your first experiment is a seed, and where do you go
Yeah.
from there? Um,
All research leads to more research. This is the problem with research. You start with one question when you do your doctorate. You get to my age, you've got about 72 and only so many years left to answer them. But little by little, I am answering, or I'm starting to answer some of these important questions about these exceptional children learning science. But none of the answers I ever get say they shouldn't be doing it. They always say they should be doing it. They should be doing it with people who know it well enough to mediate the difficulties for them without losing the thinking and understanding and those high order thinking skills about application evaluation. They can do that, and they should be given lots of opportunities to do it. So I would say the density column, that's kind of an evaluation one, isn't it?
mm-hmm,
Why are they doing them? Give me some ideas. There are lots of ideas. It's not a simple one.
mm-hmm.
It just looks fun. Don't mistake that for simple.
So I guess kind of like a question before we like just kind of make sure people are following you on Twitter. So have you ever come across a kid that couldn't be made interested in science? Made interested in science isn't quite the right word, but who
No,
in the right circumstances.
no, I haven't.
Have you tried? Have you tried to find one?
Well, I was in school teaching full time for 16 years, and I used to get a lot of the sort of disaffected bottom end. All I can say, Suzanne, is in my last sort of couple of years in school, I was trying to keep on the rails a group of very disaffected S5. They're all girls. They'd been permanently excluded from science, but they made so much noise on the landing outside that I invited them in and got them doing science in my room while I taught another year group. And they were my hardest to reach. And then and that was when I really started to take time to understand what was going on. And a lot of their issues with science were that they'd failed repeatedly because the science was too conceptually abstract for them. And I think one of the nicest testimonials I've ever had was from probably one of the two of the most troubled of that 8. And I heard the conversation. I wasn't meant to, obviously. They're out on the landing. And one says to the other, "Are you bunking off science next?" They were due to come in to me instead of sitting on the corridor. And this last said thoughtfully, "Nah, I don't think I will, because you just never know what she's going to do next. And if they only come to see what madness or mess I'm up to, they come."
I mean,
And
that gets the job done.
no, I think there's lots about finding things that are of interest and relevance to the children. That matters a lot. I think there's lots about keeping it very hands-on, not very abstract and ideasy before they've done hands-on. I haven't, but when you find one, let me know and I can do a special study.
All right then. So I guess if you look, people look at the bottom of their screens, you'll see Jane Essex's Twitter handle, and I'm sure if you have any questions, she'd be more than happy to.
I absolutely would.
As you can see, it's very easy to talk to her. Um, Someone's just said, "Jane, you're amazing. The S5 group
Oh,
story is just so inspiring." Which,
but
I,
then I sit here and rattle on. But I honestly, I have to say, I've worked with so many generous STEM experts, STEM teachers, all sorts of people.
mm-hmm.
I can only do what I do because I get such great support. So, I have to instantly say I rest on so much kindness, goodwill, accommodation of so many others. So thank you, but
Well,
not me alone.
no one works achieves these things alone. But it is always a pleasure, and thank you for taking the time out of a Saturday to
Yes,
share this with us. The
good to
video,
share with you.
yeah, the video will be available. Follow Jane on Twitter if you want to look out for other research or science content. check out the Explorathon hashtag. We've got a bunch of stuff that's been happening throughout the week and still happening today. But other than that, that I guess is thank you for joining us. Thank you,
Thank you
Jane.
very much indeed for your interest and concern in those who are excluded too often, and for
Okay.
coming to think about how we can all be doing better.
All
Have a
right.
good Saturday, everybody.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye.